The night was thick with a kind of southern humidity that made every breath feel heavy. Streetlights flickered against the shadows of Memphis, casting an eerie glow on Harold Wilkins' old Cadillac as it crawled down the nearly deserted road. Harold gripped the steering wheel, his rough hands steady, though his thoughts were anything but. At 67 years old, Harold had seen his share of life's struggles, Vietnam, raising a family on a mechanic's wages, and watching a system designed to break men like him grind on relentlessly. But tonight, none of that mattered. All Harold wanted was to get home with a bag of groceries sitting on the passenger seat and the faint comfort of his old blues station crackling through the radio. Then came the lights. Red and blue, blinding in his rearview mirror, their sharp glare cutting through the darkness like a blade. Harold's stomach dropped as the sirens wailed behind him. It wasn't fear he felt. He was far past that. No, it was something deeper, something colder. The knowledge that this encounter would be trouble, no matter how cooperative he was. Because Harold knew what it meant to be a black man alone on a quiet road at night, with a police car pulling up behind him. He let out a slow breath, muttering under his breath, "Well, here we go." He pulled over, his car sputtering as it came to a stop, and killed the engine. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car, their polished boots crunching against the gravel. One was tall, wiry, and chewing gum, with an arrogance that Harold immediately clocked. The other was broader, with a swagger that screamed entitlement. Both were white. Harold rolled down his window and kept his hands on the steering wheel, his movements slow and deliberate. "Evidence, sir," the gum-chewing officer said, shining a flashlight directly into Harold's face. "Mind telling us what you're doing out this late?" "Driving home," Harold replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Last I checked, that's not against the law." The officer smirked, clearly unimpressed. "License and registration." Harold handed over the documents without a word, his weathered face unreadable. He'd been through worse in his life, and he wasn't about to let these kids rattle him. Still, there was something in their tone, in the way they exchanged a knowing look, that made his skin crawl. The second officer leaned down, peering into the back seat like he expected to find something incriminating. "What's in the trunk?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Harold let out a dry chuckle. "A spare tire and a toolkit. Want to see? Be my guest." But they weren't here for honest questions. Harold could see that much. He stepped out of the car when they ordered him to, his hands visible and steady. The air around them felt charged, as if something was about to snap. They patted him down, their touch unnecessarily rough, but Harold didn't flinch. He'd faced far worse than this. Then came the questions. Had he been near the gas station on 5th Street earlier that night? Did he know anything about a robbery in the area? Harold stared at them, his face as steady as stone. "You really think a 67-year-old man is pulling stick-ups now? Come on." But they weren't interested in his answers. Moments later, they were slapping cuffs on his wrists, their smug faces filled with satisfaction. "You're being detained for questioning," one of them announced as they shoved him into the back of the cruiser. Harold didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just stared out the window as they drove off, his mind racing. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. The police station was as cold and unwelcoming as Harold expected, fluorescent lights flickering, stale coffee staining the air, and the kind of silence that gnawed at your nerves. It threw him into an interrogation room, where the two officers tried their best to intimidate him. They waved around flimsy accusations and hinted at evidence they didn't have. But Harold wasn't biting. He sat there, calm and unshaken, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room and every word they spoke. Hours passed. Harold wasn't sure how much time had gone by. But when they'd finally tossed him into a holding cell, he knew they didn't have anything on him. This wasn't about solving a crime. It was about making him feel small, powerless. But Harold had survived too much to let two cocky young cops break him. As dawn broke, Harold found himself being marched into a courtroom, the chains on his wrists jangling with every step. He walked in with his head held high, his posture defiant despite the circumstances. The judge looked tired, the prosecutor overconfident, and the evidence laughable. They had nothing but a grainy photo of a car that vaguely resembled Harold's old Cadillac. Still, they pressed on, trying to paint him as a suspect. Then the doors swung open. A tall man in a sharp suit walked in, carrying an air of authority that silenced the courtroom. It was Marcus, Harold's oldest grandson. Nobody really knew what Marcus did for a living. His vague assignments had always been a mystery. But one thing was clear. When Marcus entered the room, things changed. He strode up to the judge with confidence, handed over a folder, and whispered something that made her expression shift from boredom to surprise. The prosecutor tried to object, but it was too late. The judge had seen enough. She dismissed the case, her tone clipped and irritated as she turned to the officers who had arrested Harold. This man was nowhere near the crime scene. He is free to go. Harold stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he adjusted his jacket. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a subtle nod, and then walked out of the courtroom with his head held high. But as they stepped outside into the sunlight, Harold turned to his grandson, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What the hell just happened in there?" Harold asked, his voice low but firm. Marcus smirked, his expression unreadable. "Just doing what needed to be done, Grandpa. But trust me, this isn't over yet." As Harold stared at Marcus, a mix of pride and unease swelling in his chest, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. 2 black SUVs pulled up, their tinted windows gleaming ominously. Marcus' expression darkened, and Harold's heart sank. Whatever was coming, it was clear that their fight wasn't over. The rumble of the SUV's engines seemed louder than the entire city of Memphis waking up. Harold stood by his Cadillac, the weight of the past night heavy on his shoulders, as he watched the vehicles come to a halt. The doors opened in unison, and out stepped 4 men dressed in crisp suits, each one looking more serious than the last. Harold's instincts kicked in immediately. These weren't regular cops, nor were they casual passers-by. There was something calculated about their movements, the way they surveyed the scene before stepping forward. Marcus didn't flinch. He stood tall, his sharp suit barely creased, his face unreadable. Harold knew that look. It was the same one Marcus had worn at his mother's funeral, a mask of control when the world around him was crumbling. Harold wanted answers, but he also knew when to keep quiet. Now wasn't the time to start asking questions. One of the men approached Marcus, speaking in a low voice that Harold couldn't quite make out. The two exchanged a few words, the man gesturing towards Harold as if confirming something. Marcus nodded once, curt and decisive, and the man stepped back toward the SUVs, signaling to the others. Without another word, the suited men climbed back into their vehicles and drove off, leaving the air thick with unease. Harold finally broke the silence. "Marcus, you mind telling me what the hell's going on? Those weren't regular folks, and they sure weren't here for small talk." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his clean-shaven jaw. For a moment, Harold saw the boy Marcus used to be, the one who used to sit in his lap and ask questions about the stars, about life, about everything Harold didn't always have answers for. But that boy was long gone, replaced by a man Harold barely recognized. "They have associates," Marcus said vaguely, his voice low but steady. "People I work with." "Work with doing what, exactly?" Harold pressed, his eyes narrowing. "I've let you keep your secrets for years, Marcus, but now you drag me into a courtroom, and I've got men in black suits showing up like it's a dance spy movie. You're going to have to give me more than that." Marcus hesitated, his sharp demeanor cracking just slightly. "It's better if you don't know everything, Grandpa." "Safer." "Safer," Harold scoffed. "Boy, I've been through war, raised kids, and stared down more injustice than you can imagine. You think I'm scared of a little danger. Try me." But Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door of the Cadillac and gestured for Harold to get in. "Let's get out of here first," he said quietly. "We'll talk." The ride was tense, the old engine groaning under the strain of the humid morning air. Harold kept glancing at Marcus, who stared out the window, his jaw set tight. For the first time in a long while, Harold felt a pang of unease about his grandson. He'd always known Marcus was different, sharp, ambitious, and private to a fault. But now Harold was starting to wonder if he truly knew him at all. When they finally pulled up to Harold's modest home, Marcus didn't wait for an invitation. He followed Harold inside, his sharp gaze scanning a room as if checking for threats. Harold couldn't help but laugh, the sound dry and humorless. "You think someone's going to jump out of my pantry, Marcus? Relax." Marcus didn't respond. He walked to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat down, motioning for Harold to join him. Harold obliged, his curiosity outweighing his frustration. "All right," Harold said, leaning back in his chair. "Start talking." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What happened to you last night wasn't random," he began. "Those cops didn't just pull you over because they were bored or looking for trouble. They were sent." Harold frowned, his skepticism obvious. "Sent? By who? And why?" Marcus hesitated again, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say there are people who don't like when certain. Individuals ask too many questions. People who think they can control everything, from the streets to the courts. They're connected, powerful, and dangerous." "And you'll mix up with them?" Harold asked, his voice low but firm. "Is that what you're telling me?" Marcus shook his head. "Not with them. Against them. That's why I couldn't let them take you down, Grandpa. You were just an easy target, someone they thought they could pin a crime on to keep the heat off themselves." Harold leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Marcus, you've got to give me more than this cloak and dagger nonsense. What kind of questions are you asking? And what do they have to do with me?" Marcus sighed deeply, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. "I can't tell you everything," he admitted. "But I've been looking into corruption in the city. Cops, politicians, even judges. It's all connected. They've been getting away with it for years, and I've been working to expose them. When they realized I was getting close, they started targeting people I care about. That's why they went after you." Harold sat back, his mind racing. He always knew the system was broken, but hearing Marcus lay it out like this felt like stepping into a war he wasn't prepared for. "So what now?" he asked finally. "You think they're just going to let this go?" "No," Marcus said simply. "That's why I had to step in, and that's why you need to be careful." "Careful," Harold repeated, his voice rising. "Marcus, they arrested me for nothing. Tossed me in a cell like I was some kind of criminal. And you're telling me to be careful. What about you? What happens when they come after you next?" Marcus's expression hardened. "They've tried. That's why I have resources. People who can help." Harold stared at his grandson, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. But before he could ask another, there was a knock at the door. Both men froze, their eyes locking in silent understanding. Harold stood slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the cane he kept by the door, not for walking, but for defense. Marcus motioned for him to step back, his movements swift and deliberate as he approached the door. He opened it cautiously, revealing a young woman in her mid-30s, dressed in plain clothes, but with an air of quiet authority. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes taking the room before landing on Marcus. "We need to talk," she said simply. Harold watched as Marcus nodded, his face unreadable. The woman turned to Harold, offering a brief but respectful smile. "Mr. Wilkins, I'm sorry for what you've been through. I'm with Marcus on this, and I promise we're doing everything we can to make this right." Harold frowned, his patience wearing thin. "And who exactly are you?" "Someone who believes in justice," she replied cryptically before turning her attention back to Marcus. "They're moving faster than we expected. We need to act now." Harold watched as Marcus's jaw tightened, the weight of whatever he was involved in pressing down on him. The woman pulled out a folder, setting it on the table with a quiet urgency. Harold glanced at it, his curiosity piqued, but Marcus didn't open it. Instead, he turned to Harold. "Grandpa," he said, his voice steady but serious, "I need you to trust me. I know this isn't fair and I know it's dangerous, but I need you to stay out of this for now. Let me handle it." Harold leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying Marcus and the woman. Trust was something Harold didn't give easily, and after the past 24 hours, it felt like an even bigger gamble. But as he looked at his grandson, so much like the boy he'd raised, yet so different, he knew he didn't have much choice. "You better know what you're doing," Harold said finally, "because if you don't, we're all in trouble." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "I do," he said. But as the woman opened the folder and started speaking in hushed tones, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in way over their heads. Marcus glanced briefly at Harold, his eyes reflecting a mix of determination and worry. The woman beside him took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tapping the folder on the table. "We've uncovered evidence that links these officers to a larger network involved in corrupt activities," she began, her voice steady but urgent. "They've been framing innocent people to cover up their own crimes, drug deals, thefts, even worse." Harold leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "You're saying these cops have been systematically targeting black men, making them scapegoats for their own misdeeds? That's a serious accusation." The woman nodded, pulling open the folder to reveal a series of photographs and documents. "Here's what we found so far. Surveillance footage from various crime scenes shows patterns that match the cars these officers use. And we've obtained internal memos that indicate they've been communicating with each other to manipulate investigations." Marcus watched as Harold examined the evidence, the old man's sharp eyes scanning each piece with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This can't be true," Harold muttered, shaking his head. "How deep does this go?" "Deeper than we initially thought," the woman replied. "These officers are part of a network that extends beyond Memphis. They have connections in higher places, politicians, other law enforcement agencies. That's why it's been so hard to bring them down." Harold slammed his fist lightly on the table, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "So what now? You want me to just stand by while my grandson fights these bastards? I'm not getting any younger, you know." Marcus reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Harold's shoulder. "We're not asking you to fight, but your experience and knowledge are invaluable. You've lived through the worst, Harold. Your insights can help us navigate this maze." The woman stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. "Harold, we need someone who understands the system from the inside out. Someone who can help us gather more evidence without raising suspicion. You've seen how the system works, and your perspective is crucial." Harold sighed, the weight of his past battles pressing down on him once more. He looked at Marcus, seeing the same fire that had driven him through so many hardships. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this my way. No unnecessary risks." Marcus nodded, appreciating his grandfather's resolve. "Agreed. We move carefully, methodically. No reckless moves that could endanger you or anyone else." The woman handed Harold a tablet, displaying a map of Memphis with several marked locations. "These are the areas where the officers have been most active. We believe there are more innocent people who've been framed. We need to gather evidence, witness testimonies, anything that can build a solid case against them." Harold studied the map, recognizing some of the neighborhoods where he had spent most of his life. "I know some folks who might be willing to talk. They've been through similar experiences. If we can get their stories, it might help expose the truth." Marcus smiled, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. "That's exactly what we need. Your connections, your credibility, it makes a difference." As they delved deeper into the plan, the room seemed to shrink with the intensity of their discussion. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger loomed like a shadow over their every move. But Harold felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference together. Later that afternoon, Harold decided to reach out to old friends, people he trusted implicitly. He knew this path wouldn't be easy, but the thought of fighting back against the injustice burning inside him gave him the strength he needed. He called Mary, his neighbor from years ago, who had always been a pillar of support in their community. "Mary, it's Harold," he began, his voice steady despite the tension. "I need your help. It's urgent." Mary's voice was warm, tinged with concern. "Harold, what's going on? Is everything all right?" Harold took a deep breath, recounting the events of the past 2 days, the arrest, the courtroom drama, and Marcus's involvement. He explained the evidence Marcus and his team had uncovered, the network of corrupt officers, and the need for more testimonies. Mary listened carefully, her mind processing the gravity of the situation. "You're right. We can't let them get away with this. I'll reach out to others who've been affected. Together, we can build a stronger case." As Harold hung up, a sense of relief washed over him. He wasn't alone in this fight. There were others who had suffered, who were ready to stand up and demand justice. But with each step forward, the danger intensified. The corrupt officers weren't just petty criminals. They were part of a system designed to protect their own, to silence anyone who threatened their power. Meanwhile, Marcus was busy coordinating with his network, ensuring that every piece of evidence was securely stored and that their communications remained hidden from prying eyes. He knew that the more they uncovered, the greater the risk of retaliation, but the thought of Harold's unjust treatment fueled his determination. As night fell, Harold and Marcus sat together in the old Cadillac, discussing their next moves. The car, a symbol of resilience and enduring strength, seemed to embody their mission. The engine's steady hum provided a backdrop to their conversation, a constant reminder of the journey ahead. "Grandpa," Marcus began, his tone serious, "there's something else you need to know. The corruption runs deeper than we thought. There are people watching us, tracking our every move. We need to be careful." Harold nodded, his mind racing with the implications. "I've always known the system was flawed, but this is something else. We have to be smart about this, use every resource we have." As they plotted their next steps, the tension between them was palpable. The fight for justice had just begun, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. But Harold felt a renewed sense of hope. With Marcus by his side and a network of allies ready to support them, he believed they could expose the truth and bring those responsible to account. Back at his home, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the house, every distant siren, seemed to amplify his paranoia. He knew that the corrupt officers would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But he also knew that turning back was not an option. The time for silence had passed. It was time to stand up and fight. As the days turned into weeks, Harold and Marcus worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that could not be ignored. They faced setbacks and close calls, but each obstacle only strengthened their resolve. The community began to rally around them, united by a common cause and inspired by Harold's unwavering spirit. One evening, as Harold was reviewing notes in his study, there was a knock at the door. He cautiously approached, peering through the peephole to see Marcus standing there, looking more serious than ever. "Come in," Harold called out, his voice tinged with concern. Marcus entered, a folder in his hand and a look of urgency on his face. "We've made progress," he announced, "but there's something you need to see." Harold took the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside were documents that detailed the extent of the corruption, names of higher-ups involved, and dates that coincided with the recent arrests. It was more damning than anything they had found before. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice steady. "This is the proof we need to bring them down." Harold felt a surge of determination. "We need to take this to the right people. Expose them once and for all." But as they planned their next move, the sound of breaking glass shattered the calm of the night. Harold and Marcus exchanged a glance of alarm. Before they could react, masked figures surged into the room, weapons drawn and intentions clear. "Step away from the documents," one of the intruders demanded, his voice muffled by the mask. "This ends now." Harold's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the cane, ready to defend himself and his grandson. Marcus, quick on his feet, grabbed the folder and shoved it into Harold's hands. "Go, get out of here," he shouted. But it was too late. The intruders advanced, and the room descended into chaos. Harold and Marcus found themselves surrounded, the culmination of their fight for justice now coming face to face with the very corruption they sought to dismantle. As the masked men closed in, Harold looked into Marcus's eyes, seeing the same fire and determination that had driven him through countless battles. They stood together, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the fight for truth and justice was far from over. Harold's heart raced as the intruders tightened their grip on the situation. The air felt heavy with danger, every sound seemed sharper, the crunch of boots against broken glass, the rustle of papers as one of the masked men rifled through the documents scattered on the table. Marcus stood firm, his fists clenched and his gaze unwavering. Harold knew his grandson was ready to act, but the odds weren't in their favor. The leader of the group, a tall figure with a deep, commanding voice, stepped forward. "You've been digging where you don't belong," he said, pointing at Harold. "This ends tonight. Hand over the folder, and maybe we'll let you walk away." Harold tightened his grip on the folder, his knuckles whitening. "You think you can scare me? I've seen men like you my whole life. Bullies hiding behind masks and power. But you can't silence the truth." The leader chuckled darkly, his confidence unnerving. "Truth. The truth won't save you, old man. It won't save your grandson either. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady but full of defiance. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with. Corrupt cops afraid of being exposed. You're not as untouchable as you think." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension crackling like static electricity. Then, without warning, one of the intruders lunged toward Harold, trying to snatch the folder from his hands. Harold twisted away with surprising agility, his determination outweighing his age. Marcus seized the opportunity, grabbing a lamp and smashing it against the nearest intruder, sending shards of glass flying. Chaos erupted. Harold stumbled backward, clutching the folder to his chest as Marcus fought off two of the attackers with a mixture of raw strength and desperate resolve. The remaining intruder aimed a threatening glare at Harold, inching closer with each step. Harold's mind raced. He needed to protect the evidence, no matter the cost. Just as the man reached for him, Harold spotted an old baseball bat leaning against the wall. With a burst of adrenaline, he swung it with all his might, connecting with the intruder's knee. The man crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. Harold panted heavily, his heart pounding in his ears. He hadn't felt this alive, or this terrified, in years. "Grandpa, the back door," Marcus shouted, still grappling with the others. Harold hesitated, torn between staying to help his grandson and following Marcus's plan to protect the evidence. Marcus glanced at him, his eyes blazing with urgency. "Go. I'll hold them off." Reluctantly, Harold nodded and made his way toward the kitchen, clutching the folder like a lifeline. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. He slipped out the back door, his breath visible in the cold air, and hurried down the alley. His mind raced with questions. Who had sent these men? How had they known where to find him? And most importantly, was Marcus safe? Behind him, the sounds of the struggle continued. A crash, a shout, the unmistakable thud of bodies hitting the floor. Harold's chest tightened with worry, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to trust that Marcus could handle himself. Right now, the evidence was their only chance of exposing the truth. As Harold reached the end of the alley, headlights suddenly lit up the darkness, blinding him momentarily. A sleek black car screeched to a halt in front of him, and two men in suits stepped out. They weren't wearing masks, but their expressions were just as menacing. "Mr. Owens," one of them said smoothly, his voice oozing false politeness. "We've been looking for you. Hand over the folder, and this doesn't have to get messy." Harold squared his shoulders, refusing to show fear. "I've come too far to back down now," he said firmly. "If you want this, you'll have to take it from me." The man sighed, as if Harold's defiance was a minor inconvenience. "Suit yourself," he said, nodding to his partner. The second man advanced, his movements calculated and predatory. Before Harold could react, The sound of screeching tires filled the air. Another car barreled into the alley, skidding to a stop between Harold and his would-be attackers. The passenger door flew open, and to Harold's immense relief, Marcus leaned out, his face streaked with sweat and determination. "Get in," Marcus shouted. Harold didn't hesitate. He darted into the car, clutching the folder as if it were his lifeline. Marcus hit the gas, the tires squealing as the car sped away. Behind them, the men scrambled to their vehicle, giving chase. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Harold nodded, his breathing heavy. "I've been better. What about you? Did you?" "I'm fine," Marcus interrupted. "We need to focus on getting out of here. They're not going to let us go that easily." The black car loomed closer in the mirror, its headlights glaring like twin eyes. Harold glanced back, his stomach twisting with fear. "They're gaining on us." Marcus gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Not for long," he muttered, veering sharply onto a side street. The narrow road was lined with parked cars and overflowing trash bins, making it a risky maneuver. But Marcus navigated it with precision, his instincts sharper than ever. The chase continued, the black car relentless in its pursuit. Harold clung to the folder, his mind racing with the weight of their predicament. They were fighting against a system designed to crush them, and every second felt like a gamble. But despite the fear, Harold couldn't ignore the glimmer of hope in Marcus's determination. His grandson was a fighter just like him. As they approached an intersection, Marcus made a sudden decision. "Hold on," he yelled, yanking the wheel hard to the right. The car skidded into an empty parking garage, the tires screeching as they spiraled upward. Marcus killed the headlights and parked behind a concrete pillar, the engine idling softly. Harold held his breath, the silence almost deafening. The black car roared past the entrance, its drivers unaware of their hiding spot. Marcus exhaled in relief, his hands trembling slightly as he let go of the wheel. "We're not safe yet," Marcus said, his voice low. "We need to get this folder to someone who can help. Someone who isn't part of the system." Harold nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "We will," he said. "But first, we need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." The tension hung heavy in the air as they sat in the darkness, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. They had evaded danger for now, but the fight was far from over. Harold and Marcus knew that the truth they carried was a threat to powerful people, and those people wouldn't stop until it was silenced. Their next move would determine everything.